Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome back. We'll get started here in a couple minutes. Hello, welcome for those just joining us. And if folks who are just joining, if you could add your name and pronouns and affiliation in your Zoom name, that would be awesome. As we wait for some folks to come in. And welcome, thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to those just joining us. If you could please add your name, pronouns, and affiliation in your Zoom name, that would be wonderful. Thank you. We'll get started here in a couple of minutes. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. If you're just joining us, if you could add your name, pronouns, and affiliation to your Zoom name, that would be wonderful. And if you're from the city, if you can just add city to your name, that would be great. We'll wait another. See. What do you think? Should we get started, Vin? Should we wait another minute or so?
I think that sounds great to get started. Thanks.
Okay, great. All right. Well, welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining us. I know this has been quite a bit of meetings over the last few months, so we really appreciate your time. Today is the fourth of 5 tenant working group meetings. So our theme today is on anti-displacement and implementation standards. So we'll have more context on that coming up. But if this is the first time you're attending, we'd like to welcome you. And if you participated in the last working group, welcome back. We're glad to see you. As usual, if you didn't participate in the last tenant working group meeting, Wing is going to put in a link in the chat of the recording. So you can take a look at that, that YouTube link and catch up on what we talked about. My name's Irene Kim. I'll be your facilitator for the tenant working group sessions. And we're very delighted to have you all here today again and provide input into the HEART standards. So just like in past meetings, we ask that you speak to your values, your vision, and your experience as we discuss our topics for today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I wanted to remind everybody that the city is holding office hours through mid-June. I think the last day is June 16th. So you can use that time to talk to Ben and other staff members if you have any questions about the HEART standards or any technical sort of clarifications you'd like to chat about. So I'll put those dates here in the chat as a reminder. And before we get started here, I wanted to just do a quick recap of the last tenant working group meeting, and then also a recap of the fourth building working group meeting, which happened last week. So in the third tenant working group meeting 2 weeks ago, we focused on equitable energy. So I just wanted to, I'll share a couple highlights we heard from that meeting. We asked about sort of what your experience is when the power goes out. You know, how do you charge your devices? How do you cook food, stay warm or cool during the summer? Some common things we heard were having solar battery packs and rechargeable batteries handy. Being able to store enough food and water is very critical for lots of folks. So that's a big priority. And then having go bags and emergency kits available. And there's some organizations that provide those types of kits for more frontline vulnerable communities as well. And then we asked about what characteristics you value in different renewable energy sources and what your concerns are. So Vin shared just some background on different types of renewable energy sources. And so what we heard from you is that that there was sort of a desire for more information about just the pros and cons of different renewable energy sources, and just sort of a more holistic understanding of how those work, and especially how those kind of change over time. And then we heard some thought or ideas about whether, you know, could we look into Indigenous communities for lessons in how to live more sustainably and take care of our environment. And then there are comments about being able to depend on a more diversified mix of energy sources. So that's also, you know, thinking about having a backup plan and multiple options to get through emergencies was something that we heard. And also thinking about renewable energy and building improvements from a community ownership and wealth building perspective. So not just thinking about it as, you know, improvements that folks have to make, but how do we build a system, you know, how can communities build systems that work for them and also use renewable energy systems to generate wealth within their communities. And then there was also some comments about the need for large scale storage of access wind and solar being available. And then in our second kind of breakout sessions, we asked about what do renters need to know about energy use and utility bill costs in deciding on where to live in apartments. So one key thing we heard is that transparency is very essential. So, you know, requiring regular audits of buildings and also thinking about accountability. So what happens after those audits happen, and then being transparent about the outcomes of those audits. That they should be clearly displayed and understood, maybe showing comparisons to an average and helping people really understand what this means and what the implications are. And then there are also ideas about providing a snapshot of what previous tenants were paying in utility bills and then some mutual understanding between both tenants and landlords about their rights and responsibilities. We also finally asked about how and where should this information be shared, like such as annual reports and disclosures on a web page, or energy scorecards or building labels. A couple things we heard is to leverage culture-specific organizations, schools, faith-based organizations, et cetera, to help disseminate information more broadly. And also that those types of partnerships and relationships are very critical in building trust and awareness around the importance of making these improvements. There are other ideas about sharing a dashboard of information, either through Zillow or Portland Maps, disclosing average energy costs for each building. But also to be cognizant that renters are taken to lots of different platforms to either find apartments or kind of get through their search for housing. So having a central place to get this information is better and more equitable for tenants. And then last week, the building working group met for the fourth time to talk about anti-displacement implementation. So the topics we'll be talking about today. So a couple highlights from that meeting that we discussed. We asked about how building investments can be funded without passing on the costs to renters. So we'll be asking the same question today with you all. So just a couple of things that we heard from the building working group is that we heard thoughts about how we can incentivize early action. So how challenging it is and helping people understand the upfront costs and investments that it will take to see, benefits that will happen further down the road. So some really important kind of framing and marketing around the importance of these types of kind of early investments and incentivizing early action. And then also some other ideas about expediting permitting, waiving permitting fees, and SDC waivers for building improvements as incentives, and also property tax reductions were some ideas that came up. Other ideas were also, how PSEF funds can be leveraged to take action more quickly and support more residents at risk of displacement. And then thinking a little bit more broadly of how can state and local governments sort of de-silo funding sources and programs to work better together. And thoughts about that, Portland, the city of Portland can be a model for a citywide solution, but that statewide or metro-wide funding bases could be much more efficient and meaningful in sort of getting to our target goals. And then finally, there are ideas about phasing in multifamily buildings later in the implementation instead of doing everything at both commercial and multifamily at the same time to sort of help ease the burden a bit, and but also to be mindful of the time it will take for property owners to make these improvements and with the least amount of disruption. So those are some discussions that we had at the building working group. Again, you can go back to the YouTube video links and sort of review that meeting later on in your own time as well. And then also just to mention that we also did some live polling questions as well, which we'll do today about kind of what the minimum size of commercial and multifamily buildings for buildings that the standard should apply to, and how often compliance cycles should be when it should start. So you can see those polling results in the video as well. So I'll stop there, and I wanted to sort of go over our agenda today. So let me share my screen here real quick. Okay, so here we go. So we'll start with a discussion on anti-displacement and cost consideration. So we have a small group discussion prepared to go over that topic after Vin provides a little bit of context for that discussion. And then we'll go to a quick break and then talk about the implementation of these standards. So we have some polling exercises and also an interactive activity to do as a large group, and we'll discuss afterwards before we close out here today. Just just a quick, I guess, heads up before we go into these large group activities. They're gonna, if you're on your phone, we'll have a way for you to participate. But if you can get to like a computer or desktop, that would be probably the easiest for you to participate. So just a heads up that if you're able to do that, but if you're on your phone, that's okay. We'll have an alternative way to get your thoughts as well. And then just a couple quick Zoom reminders to please stay on mute unless we're on discussion mode. And then put yourselves on do not disturb on your phones and computers to kind of limit any distractions if possible. And then, of course, you can always use the chat to pose any questions. We'll be monitoring that and responding to anything you hear or using your reactions on your Zoom application. And then if you're having any technical issues, Wing is available to help troubleshoot anything. So feel free to chat or message Wing directly or add something to the chat room if you're having any technical issues. Okay, so like we've done before, feel free to introduce yourselves. I see a couple of folks have already been doing that in the chat box, and we'll have some time to do some introductions in your small groups. But feel free to say hi to folks and introduce yourselves in the chat right now if you'd like. And then with that, I will turn it over to Vin to start us off in our first discussion topic on anti-displacement.
Great, thank you, Irene. And thanks everyone especially for being here, especially for the folks that have made it through now the fourth meeting for the Tenant Working Group. And as Irene noted, there is a fifth meeting next week, June 8th, Wednesday, same time, same place, where we'll be with the Building Working Group as well. And as we close out today, I'll provide a reminder in the topics that we'll cover too. All right, so let's see, I'll go ahead and start presenting some info here. Let's see, looks like I need to here. Okay, how does that look?
That looks great.
Great, thank you. Move my chat out of the way so I can see my screen a little better. All right, so meeting number 4, implementation. We've been talking a lot about standards and different types of standards. And I want to go, before we get into implementation, back into some more weeds, just go high level for a minute. So what I'd like to do is, let's see if this will advance. Go back to the vision. So the vision is commercial, multifamily, residential buildings that are healthier for us, for tenants of both commercial and residential, more energy efficient, that are renewably powered and even regenerative, so making the earth a better place, and resilient to the impacts of climate change in the future. And we covered quite a bit of that in earlier meetings, but we were all experiencing it. And summer's here. This time last year, we were starting to hear the murmurs that, hey, there might be this giant heat wave. And then within a couple of weeks, within a few weeks, we were experiencing it. Our first heat dome event in the Pacific Northwest is devastating. Grave concern, literally. And so here we are coming back into the summer season. And I just wanted to take a moment to really kind of think about like that's what we're preparing ourselves for. And part of resilience is also reducing carbon emissions. Brief recap on that multi-thousand page intergovernmental panel on climate change. What they added in that I saw was really different from any few previous years. There are 6 assessment report that came out in February this year, was that we can't simply try to make ourselves resilient to climate change. We have to reduce carbon emissions too, that is now a resiliency strategy. We keep on adding more emissions that live in the atmosphere for hundreds of years or more, then it's not just human systems, but ecosystems will be pushed beyond the brink of repair. So big concern there. And then on top of that, we need to think very locally, and that whatever we do, we don't want to threaten low-income tenants with more rent increases, because we really want to be centered on displacement. We haven't talked that much about displacement. I think we've been considering it all along. Um, and within the build shift work that's happened to develop this policy concept, so the collaborative effort with the city and community organizations, community members in Black and Brown space to really kind of focus on climate justice, not just on reducing carbon emissions, but how do we advance racial equity. Anti-displacement has been at the center of that work from the beginning. And as we call them, the HEART standards, they're our acronym. The A is the center with anti-displacement. I wanted to thank Build Shift and specifically Taryn Evans for suggesting the acronym here, because I think it really speaks to this work, that we focus on anti-displacement because we are heart-centered. It's about the people, not just the buildings. So reflecting back on the work of Build Shift over 2 years of engagement. So this is community-led engagement that the city partnered in, mostly in a listening capacity. So what we heard is there needs to be minimum standards and upgrades for rentals. We heard that wasn't just about energy and carbon, and that we need to consider health, resilience, and temperature. And that's why we've been looking at in the last few meetings here in more detail. But for the energy piece, lowering utility bills is a way to prevent displacement if the lowering utility bills doesn't result in higher rent. So the key here is stable rent. Something to consider is that there's rent control at the state level. I would call that a weak rent control, and unfortunately, it preempts the city from having its own rent control. So that's why we really need to be sensitive to investments into energy or health and resilience and temperature standards, that they can have the unintended consequences of increasing rent and then causing displacement. So that's why we really need to be centering our work in anti-displacement too. So one of the things we talked about in the Build Shift meeting spaces is to prevent displacement is to have some type of incentives. So some type of funding, for instance, like Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund, or PSEF. PSEF is one of the funding methods that could or allow for investment to buildings without raising rent and putting the burden on renters. One of the reasons we focus on rentals so much and why we created a tenant working group is because of what we call a split incentive. So we, referring to the city, but also it's been often used within the energy world and within the Build Shift space, we refer to it regularly now. So thinking about energy bills. So this is a problem where the landlords, it's where the tenants pay their own bills. And so the landlords, if they don't pay the bills, they don't have an incentive then to make an energy investment where they might realize the benefits of that and lower utility bills. But if they did pay the bills, then maybe they would. So often the city will think like, oh, homeowners have that incentive to invest into their homes and reduce their energy bills. They can make that long-term investment. But we don't see that happening a lot for apartment building owners. Some do. When they do, sometimes it's upgrading their apartment building, and it results in a different quality of building and higher rent in that way. Some do it because it's the right thing to do. That is more the exception, I'd say, than the rule. So the concern here, though, is if they do make the improvements and they do raise rent, then that contributes to displacement. What we really want to do is think of like, how do we reduce the bills, not increase rent? And then particularly that winter heating bill as an anti-displacement strategy. Okay, so I wanted to go through some examples of what we've been talking about with the standards over the last few weeks. And as we think about like, what level of investment are we talking about for landlords into their buildings? So the areas that we focused on as a recap are health, resilience, including temperature, and equitable energy. So reducing carbon emissions. So examples of indoor air quality that we've talked about is to have some type of filters to capture pollutants and airborne diseases. We've also talked about residential stove ventilation to the outdoors, and particularly for natural gas stoves. We have talked about having one room at least have an air conditioner. Air conditioning increases carbon emissions, but a heat pump is an air conditioner that when operating reverse overall throughout the year, it's very super efficient, 4 times more efficient than in winter heating. It can reduce energy bills and reduce carbon emissions. And then we've talked about at least one room in an apartment. We talked about like looking at cooling centers outside of apartments, and really what we heard is that this needs to be accessible within the home. And that it's not necessarily the entire apartment, which can be very expensive, both for the investment for air conditioning, if it's central air, but also for those who pay the bills. So that for the renter, it can be really expensive to cool an entire home. So we heard one room is the minimum. And so with reducing carbon emissions, some examples to do that are weatherization, insulation, and window replacement. So that's the envelope, the example here on the right. The picture is an apartment building over at 15th and Hawthorne, and had an extensive weatherization update that include window upgrades. Internally, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems, the HVAC systems, can be upgraded. Those are on their own lifetimes too. They are rarely last more than 20 years or so, or if they are still there, they're not high functioning anymore, and so they can become really inefficient. So when they are at the end of their life, that's an opportunity to upgrade those systems as well. And then another option is to be thinking about not even doing anything to the building, but adding solar to the top of the building, or in the future, selecting renewable energy supply from the utilities or a community-based energy system. One thing to think about that though is if the building is not energy efficient, that's going to mean that it needs a lot more solar panels. There's only so much roof space, but also the solar panels are a big investment themselves. So less panels, to get to less panels, one of the ways to do that is more energy efficiency investment, which also right now is less costly than investing in solar. For most buildings. For super energy efficient buildings, the solar becomes cost efficient. Okay, so let's do a little more background here, and it's like where we've had conversations around displacement, because we have been talking about it. And so we talked, as I mentioned, like reducing energy cost burden, reducing those bills. That's something we want to do. I mentioned that there's utility-based renewable energy, and some of that is we're going to see in the near term, meaning that I shouldn't say too near term, but because of House Bill 2021, by 2040, the our electricity to Portland will be renewable by 2040. To get there, right now, we know that would cost more. So that investment could result in higher utility bills. So we need to be thinking about that too, right? But fortunately, the advocates for this bill were also working on another bill, House Bill 2475, that now allows utilities to create differential rate classes. And so we're already starting to see that House bill roll out to, they're establishing income qualified bills discounts. So for instance, PG now for low income folks is offering a 25% bill discount. So as renewable energy becomes more integrated into our electricity supply by the utilities, by law, they now need to do that. It may cost more, but now there's an option to have a discount for low-income folks. So that's one of the ways that I see anti-displacement happening at the state level with utilities. Something else we've talked about is just avoiding unintended consequences. So I already mentioned kind of minimizing the pass-through of compliance costs to renters. Another way to think about it is the non-compliance costs. So what happens if there's a penalty? Often in lease agreements, there's a line in there that says if the city, the county, or another government makes us do anything, then the renters then has to pay for it. So in this case, if the building owner received a significant non-compliance penalty, we wouldn't want that to be passed on to renters either. Something else that we have noted, I think, fairly briefly in earlier meetings, but it is also important, is to be thinking about, could the result of this these standards take rental housing off the market. So an example that in one of the breakout sessions I was in, I believe it was in the building working group though, was that if the standards are set so high at the beginning to reduce emissions, and the building owner of an existing building, let's say it's a really energy inefficient building, they might look at that as, wow, I can no longer really operate this building for profit. And so I'd rather just sell it off and have somebody redevelop it. And it's an older building anyway, and it has all these other issues. Maybe this is the final straw. And so we don't want that to be an unintended consequence. For now, less rental housing stock means more demand for housing, which means less affordability. Another thing that came up in the building working group is also be thinking about, is there a time period if there is a major retrofit to the building where tenants have to move out? So we don't want that to happen either, to relocate tenants. But we need to look at that a little closer to assure that isn't the outcome of this policy, because really we are centered on anti-displacement, whether short-term or long-term. So one of the strategies to prevent displacement then I mentioned was to have some type of funding. So there's Portland Clean Energy Fund that I mentioned. Energy Trust of Oregon provides utility incentives. A lot of their programs have gone to the folks who have the incentive to make those upgrades. So and historically, a lot of on the residential level, a lot of their incentives have gone to residential homeowners, but they are starting to change their programs to realizing that the split incentive has resulted in a lot of underinvestment into multifamily apartments. So we're seeing a lot of their programs now start to shift to be delivered to where the need is. Another option out there is financing. So although it's not directly going to offset the entire cost, financing can spread out the cost over many years, and that can reduce the need to increase rent. So an example of that is Property Fit. It's through Prosper Portland. It's long-term financing. It covers reduced energy efficiency investments as well as rooftop solar. And then the energy savings are used to repay the improvements through the county tax structure. So those are some examples of what's out there right now, but we are looking for new ideas. And so we're going to go into some breakout rooms and just thinking about so who pays for this? Because the easy answer is, well, those who can afford it should pay. The building owner should pay for it. But if they're just passing along those costs to the renter, then it's the renter who pays. So we wanted to, it's been a long conversation within the Build Shift discussions we've had. And we wanted to extend that conversation to the folks who are in the room today.
Great, thanks, Vin. Any questions or any clarifying questions to ask either in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself before we go into breakout. Okay, no questions? We're all good? Okay, I'm not hearing anything. I don't see anything in the chat. So great. That might give us a little bit more time to be in our discussion groups. Wing, if you have all the groups set up, let's open those up right now, and then we'll be back. Let's come back at 1:10. So we'll have about 25 minutes or so to discuss. And then, Vin, do you want to go over the ground rules real quick? Thanks, Wing, for putting that.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Do you have those slides?
Yeah, I'll do that. All right, here we go.
Okay, so these are the almost said building performance standards. This is the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability shared ground rules. And so we have noted these in all the meetings. So I wanted just to point to especially this last one. So before I get there, those number one, listen to understand and not respond. And then so kind of that deep listening of really not thinking of what the answer is going to be, try not to get defensive. If we have a lot of different perspectives in the room here, we want to honor that diversity. And so the second one, though, is where I really wanted to focus here is why am I talking? Wait. So I'm an open processor. You all probably got a sense for that, getting to know me over these last few meetings. Some of you know me for a long time. I speak too much. I've probably have already spoken too much already today. So if you're like me, maybe question why am I talking right now, and share a little more space for others so we can hear from everyone, especially in the small group discussion. Um, and then the last one here is a fill in the blank. So I did fill this in as make space for all to be heard. That in the small group discussion, our facilitators will want to move along and make sure we hear from everyone. Fortunately, we're running a little ahead of schedule since there weren't questions, and so I think we will hear from everyone, and that we want to do that, right? So, but in the large discussion, we're doing a different format in the second half of our meeting today. In the large discussion, the questions we have are not necessarily questions that everybody might answer. But if you have an opinion, we really want to hear from you. So if you have already kind of shared in your opinion, please like take a minute to create more space. And sometimes that's just allowing for some blank space for a while for others to step in. Irene and I tried to come up with a design of polling questions as well as an activity that aren't just about the answers to the polling question or what happens in the activity, but really to engage us into be thinking about some of these key considerations that we need to sort through around which buildings should be covered and what standards apply under what timeline. That we really want to hear feedback. So these exercises are designed to get us thinking about it. And then what's really rich for us is to hear your opinions on it. So I would encourage not only why am I talking, but why am I not talking? And we really encourage, especially in that large group discussion, to please be as robust as you can in sharing your opinions.
Great, thanks, Ben. And before we break out, I just wanted to remind folks of the values that you all came up with in the very first tenant working group many weeks ago. And just keep this in mind as you go into breakout and as a reminder of just some overarching values as you listen and discuss. So I just wanted to share that real quick. I think with that, we'll open up the breakouts and come back here at 1:10 to share a large group report out.
Sorry about that feedback. Nina, were you in a breakout room previously or did you just join? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I just had to drop to take a phone call, so I don't know where I was going. Do you want to send me somewhere, or are they coming back within a minute or two?
It's going to be quite a little bit. They're coming back at 1:10, so I will put you in a room that
Perfect.
has some fewer people. So hold on just a sec.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi there, Kim. Folks are in breakout sessions. Were you already here and leave, or were you already in a breakout session? I guess is what I'm asking.
No, I wasn't already. I had a meeting conflict. I don't want to interrupt anyone's little breakout session either. I can just wait, I guess, or
Yeah, no problem. They've been in there for a little while, but they're coming back in 5 minutes. Is that okay with you?
yes, that sounds best.
Great. Okay. Nice to see you, by the way.
Oh, you too. Bye-bye.
Okay. Are we still waiting for some folks to join? All right, Great. I think everyone's back. Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you had enough time to have a good, robust discussion. We'll start with some large group report outs here, and let's start with Vin's group.
All right, thanks. We had some great discussion. I'm going to try to, some of it was weaving back and forth, so I'm going to try to put it together here in a minute. So I think initially we just started off kind of recognizing how complicated it is on the owner's end financially, and that we need to be cautious not to get involved into the finances of a property, particularly when there's unintended consequences that can happen. Like examples of that were in San Francisco, where there's rent control, and the result of that is taking housing off the market sometimes, which then overall makes the housing costs go up. And then, sorry, let me jump back up for a minute. And then that we need to have really focus on the core issue of ownership, and that we need to have more creative ownership options for tenants, and opportunities for tenants to own their own buildings, and have things like first right of refusal when a building is for sale for the tenants to purchase that. And one idea in here is that there should be taking another stab at the tenant, the direct funds for opportunity to purchase, so for tenants' opportunity to purchase. And we had talked about how we need to be careful not to put strings attached for owners, because if we have an incentive with strings attached, they might not want to participate. And that kind of played into the same idea of, well, if we don't have strings attached for owners, we also shouldn't have strings attached for tenants, and really kind of serving the tenant need for ownership as a solution. But yeah, maybe I'll end it there. And just generally, we can't lose more of the housing stock that's affordable right now.
Right. Great. Thanks, Vin. We'll go to Michelle and then Dirk.
Thank you. And I tried to find a volunteer for my group, not realizing that it would be on me to report out. So we had far-reaching conversations, and my notes are very choppy, so I'll just read a few that I thought were interesting. One of the things that came up was terms and conditions, and the word clawback was used, but whereby an incentive is given to a building owner, and in exchange for agreeing to terms that have some social benefit for renters. That could be, increased indoor air quality. That could be, better windows and insulation. It could be also a promise to not raise rents, ridiculously, like to agree perhaps to a cap on what rents could be raised to. So like a good neighbor agreement. I wrote down the social cost of carbon, because just for my own edification, looking at impacts of low income, looking at the state legislature and the PUC conversations that are happening around this trade-off. I mean, the conversation with the PUC and the state legislature, and what they can do to help come up with some of these funding mechanisms. Looking at how utilities actually perform. So as a basis for rate setting, rate making, if we were kind of compare utilities across the state, are there some that are more energy efficiency? Are there some that are offering social benefits, and offering tiered a tiered approach to rate making? I'm sorry, these are my notes are very choppy. Tax incentives were talked about at the state level to incentivize owners to write in requirements to agree to maintain rent rates, and perhaps differentiate rent rates to address 50%, 60%, 80% MFI, median family income, in exchange for any investments that they would receive that are publicly funded. And then also there was a little piece about education on the landlord side, to educate landlords on the benefits of having more energy efficiency units. benefits such as renter stability, lower maintenance costs, longer tenancies, reduced maintenance, increased tenant satisfaction. So looking at avoiding the costs of vacancies and trying to focus on the long-term benefits of investing in energy improvements.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Dirk, anything new to share that came up that that you haven't heard yet?
Well, I thought it was just my group that was coming up with all these amazing ideas, but I guess everybody else was too, because they're very similar. Yeah, we had some that strings should be applied to incentives. Like if someone's going to get incentives to upgrade an apartment complex, that they shouldn't be able to raise the rent for a certain amount of time was an idea. Another one that I thought was interesting was like a rating system that would go with the apartment complex or the apartment itself, for example. So one example was this apartment complex is healthy, climate resilient, and has cooling, something like that. Something that would give them some recognition, maybe some market power as well, to where renters would be drawn to want to live there because this is a healthy and climate resilient place to live, which I thought that was a pretty cool one as well. And then another one was, yeah, technical expertise for building owners and guidance for them as well. And then I guess just the last one, which I thought might be interesting, is maybe helping disparate building owners with buying power, like helping them combine their buying power to buy down costs of equipment to do certain upgrades, like costs of HVAC and things like that. So yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. And then I'll go to Pam and then also share a quick report back as well. Go ahead, Pam.
Yeah, so we had some similar but different ideas. I think there was general agreement that there's kind of a priority order around energy efficiency for building envelope as well as water consumption to help drive the prices down to begin with for renters. And so we discussed similar ideas around tax or incentive or low interest loans for landlords, but again, with those strings attached that would put some type of rent stabilization or no increase to rent for a certain number of years. We also talked about like contract signing. So if there were, funds that were offered for the standards that landlords wouldn't receive the funds unless they agreed to certain stipulations for tenants, and mostly rent control or ability to keep rents low. But we also sort of flipped the equation around to recognize that it's not just about keeping the rents lower, but also about wages and wage increases, and the fact that, perhaps there's some way to like adjust wages, create like a lifestyle wage. If rent can be adjustable, then wages should be adjustable as well, especially at the lower tiers. And so that got us into some discussion about some research out of the University of Washington on what a family of four really needs to survive. So cost of family stability index versus just cost of living. We also talked about the fact that retired people get cost of living adjustments because we all know prices go up, but if you're a working person, you don't necessarily get any kind of guaranteed increase in your wages.
So this transportation plan,
we talked about creating some type of, we called it a loyalty incentive for people that stay long-term. So right now you might just have an agreement with your landlord that if you perform certain activities or, do certain things, then you get stabilization in your rent. But why couldn't we figure out a way to institutionalize that and provide an incentive for that if we then also, if landlords agreed to have some type of energy efficiency or building efficiency standards, or I guess, incentives that they put into the building. I promised my group they could jump in if I missed anything. What did I miss, gang?
how to navigate through that.
Yeah, if folks want to chime in or add anything on the chat, that'd be great. All right, so let me quickly share what our group did. I hear some, oh, there you go. Thanks, Pam. Okay, so yeah, we talked about a lot of similar things that have already been mentioned. So I'll just mention some other kind of interesting things that came up. There's a program in Maine where they are paying for heat pumps to be installed and, you know, have installers come in and do the work. So there's a model that's happening in another, in the state of Maine, where if you qualify, they don't have to pay for these types of like heat pump systems, which is interesting. I'm curious how they're sort of paying for that. And then there's, let's see, some other things that came up, ideas of like, is there some economies of scale for how like construction crews and labor to sort of install and build some of these improvements and contracts and have steady work coming in as well. So thinking more about how this can impact BIPOC and minority-owned construction companies, and kind of help compensate a prevailing wage, and maybe have the city supplement some of those wages as well, and sort of have a system for or a funding mechanism around that. And then just another key thing was that communications is super important. And so really making, I think the word like spoon feeding, how these improvements get made and what building owners need to do, and having really clear targets and processes, and anticipating what requirements are happening when is going to be super important, and making sure that things go smoothly and everyone understands what they need to do. So those are some key things that came up. Okay, so we're a little
Sorry,
bit.
can I interrupt real quick? Sorry,
Yeah,
I know
go
we're
ahead.
running a little behind, but Pam, you reminded me that maybe there's something that I missed, and I did miss something for my group. It goes back to something you mentioned, Michelle, about the social cost of carbon. So we did have kind of like, our conversation went to kind of like, well, if owners, and is this just about owners and tenants, and who carries the burden there, and kind of reassurance that both are kind of responsible. But there was a sentiment of there needs to be an investment at some level, even if it's public funds, because we're paying the public health aspects of increasing asthma and houselessness right now. So there's these other social costs that are being paid, and the consequences of not having standards are being paid by the public. So yes, I just wanted to share that one last thing that I forgot to mention.
Great, thanks, Vin. Okay, so before we go out into our second discussion topic, let's take a quick break. So let's come back at, let's see, 1:28. And then, so we'll take a 5-minute break, come back at 1:28, and we'll get started on our next topic here. Okay. Is everyone back? Get a bite to eat. Hopefully do a little bathroom break, get some water. So if you can share your screen or share your video real quick or give a reaction to let me know that you're there, be wonderful. And then, great, thanks. Awesome, thank you. And I will turn it over to Vin to introduce our second topic on implementation of standards.
Great. Thanks, Irene. Welcome back, everybody. So we'll be in large group discussion after this, plus an activity as we focus on implementation. Let's see, go to current slide. Okay, so there's 3 areas of implementation that we'd like to look at, and we might not get to all 3 today in the building working group. We didn't get to enforcement, or we might get through part of the enforcement conversation. But we want to be thinking about which buildings should be covered, and then we'll have a poll around that, and then we'll then talk about compliance cycles and thinking about how to prioritize the standards over long term and short term. To the next slide. So we're thinking about which buildings should be covered. Here's something to consider. This is based on our model of the city that was created as part of our early work called the Zero Cities Project. It really had 2 goals, and one was to advance racial equity, and that's what led to the community-led engagement that eventually led to the proposal that we have that we're looking at now. The other part was to build a net zero roadmap, meaning how do we actually get to 0 carbon emissions by 2050, which is the city's stated goal, adopted goal. And one of the nice outcomes of that work is there's a consultant, Architecture 2030, they're a nonprofit. They worked with us to build a model, because right now when we look at the carbon emissions from the city, we have, up until this model, we at the city, we have an annual inventory that's based on energy data that comes from the utilities, and that data is sorted into commercial, residential, and industrial. And we have no data to break it down from there. So it's really hard to figure out where should we focus? What's the impact of having a policy in one area versus another? We didn't really have that detail. So we created this model. And one of the interesting things about the model is we looked at 20,000 square foot buildings and larger, and the emissions, estimated emissions from those buildings. It turns out, if we look at all the buildings, including all of our single family residential homes, so the detached homes across Portland, all of the apartment buildings, all the condominium buildings, all of the commercial buildings, that if we just look at the buildings that are over 20,000 square feet, that's half of the emissions in Portland from the building sector. So administratively, when we think about these standards, we've been talking about them, right? Just in the last conversation, it's pretty complicated. And to administer it, if we focus on the largest buildings, we can actually cover quite a bit of the carbon emissions. So that's one of our questions we're going to have for you all and we'll have a poll. The poll isn't to build consensus or to get the right answer. The poll is to engage us into thinking about what are some of the considerations when we think about which buildings should be covered and why. So we'll have discussion. So Irene's going to guide us through a lot of discussion around the results of the poll too. So please participate in the poll, but also please engage in the larger group discussion. A little more background though, before we do that. So when we talk about 20,000 square feet, that's a little hard to visualize. So I'm going to have a visual for that in a second. But one way to think about it is in terms of units. And so a 2-bedroom apartment is generally right around 1,000 square feet. Large 1-bedroom apartment is also a very large 1-bedroom apartment is also around 1,000 square feet. So one of the ways we can think about this is a 20-unit building is roughly 20,000 square feet. So pretty easy for an exchange of numbers to do some math there. We talked about the commercial building program where there's energy reporting last meeting 2 weeks ago. That's the annual reporting and disclosure on the map that we've been doing for 4 years. We're taking a break during the pandemic. We're relaunching that program this year. that also applies to 20,000 square feet and above. So this is an example of a 20,000 square foot building. It's the Burnside Rocket at Burnside and 12th on the east side. So it gives you a sense of what that scale is of visually, what does that size of building look like? So you can imagine this is about 20 unit building also for if this was an apartment building. For the covered commercial buildings, this results in the 1,000 largest commercial buildings in Portland. We do have some significant exemptions within that program though. Like we don't cover any industrial buildings. A big one is warehouses. There's hundreds of warehouses in Portland that we don't cover, mostly because they're not heated or cooled. And then schools are not included. They already report to us. And then places of worship are not included because we didn't want to place the burden of energy reporting on places of worship that only are only used often one day per week. So anyhow, that gives us some kind of background as we go into the poll. I think that is, yep, that's my last slide for that. Wayne, can you set us up with a poll and I'll stop sharing. By the way, Wing again is in the background running all the logistics, Wing Dorowski. If you ever have a logistical question, you can always put that in the chat for him, direct message him. All right, here we go.
There's before we do that, or there's a question from Ronnie. Are there 1K buildings before or after the exemptions?
Oh, after.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so total commercial buildings is closer to like over 2,000.
Okay.
So the warehouses exempt quite a few in the industrial buildings.
So I see some folks already responding to the polling here. So the question is, what minimum size of residential buildings should the standards apply to? You could provide your responses here. Give you all maybe another minute or two to respond. The choices are 4 units, 10 units, 20 units, or more than 20 units. So, okay, looks like we have the majority of folks participating. So 4 units is coming out on top, is the majority preferred choice. And then 10 units, and then less preference on 20 or more units. So anyone want to share sort of your thoughts on why you chose the option you did? So let's start with maybe the folks that chose 4 units or 10 units. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and share some thoughts on why you chose that?
I guess I would share that I think it'd be great to start with 20 units, but I imagine this being a phased process, and eventually we want to get more than 50% reduction in emissions. And I also think that the more I thought about it after the building meeting last week, it's also a justice issue. We want families to be comfortable, and what we're doing here is kind of working against deferred maintenance and making sure that over the long run, even smaller units, that families are comfortable and safe. And so I think eventually we want to bring it down, even if it's a phased process.
Great, thanks, Diane. I see some hand clapping and applause for your comments there. Thank you. Erica has her hand up. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I was. I picked 10 kind of for similar reasons, and I'm assuming I think phased probably makes sense. The one thing I was thinking about with 4 is in terms of trying to maintain affordable housing stock. Is that like 4 is the unit where honestly it kind of seems like we need more people to want to help do rentals and stuff, and a 4 unit is kind of sometimes like where people are kind of entering and just kind of starting to become landlords, you know what I mean? So you can get it on a conventional mortgage, stuff like that. And I think, the more, or, maybe someone who's trying to buy something and they're going to live in a unit and have others, like the more you want to like trying to extend regulations down to people who are kind of just getting started or smaller, or maybe retirees, you know, like it just might make it really complex and seem onerous, and then people may give up, and then we might, you know, that was my one thing about maybe starting with the bigger buildings and all that sort of stuff, and then kind of re-auditing and, you know, seeing, you know, and also just in terms of staffing complexity, like the cost of this program, obviously, you know, being able to get more bang for your buck with dealing with fewer buildings and professional management and stuff like that versus going all the way down to kind of a lot of times where you're dealing with a billion different owners, I think it's just going to make the complexity and the headaches of the program much higher, would be my thought.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Anyone else want to share kind of thoughts on why you chose 4 units or 10 units? And feel free to raise your hand. Great. Nina, go ahead.
So my whole thought on this is we have to like be very pragmatic about this as it rolls out. And I would be really, you know, I know you guys are going to go back once we get through these meetings and craft the exact nature of the policy. But boy, I would like to know the data and like to understand what the building stock is, how old it is, how much of it has been retrofitted or how much of it hasn't. So we really, because it's hard for me to choose a number like this when I don't understand where the majority of these places are. And I think spending some money to understand really what you are dealing with right now would help make the answers to these questions more obvious and create a better policy. I think it's very dangerous to ask these questions when we don't know what our stock looks like.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you, Nina. Appreciate that comment. Okay, so I want to just cover real quick folks who chose 20 units or more than 20 units. Does anyone want to share sort of why you chose those options?
So I chose that option. I wouldn't be against going smaller. I just got kind of anchored to the presentation of 20 units, and I thought it would be good for incremental change.
Okay, thanks, Ronnie. Great. Well, thank you so much for participating in that polling. And I see a comment here of that it's a good point about building size and age and where the need is. Great. Okay, so let's move on to our next sort of activity here. And before we do that, I'm going to turn over to Vin to provide some additional context here.
Thank you. Let's see here. Great feedback, everyone. Thank you. That's exactly what we're looking for. Back to the presentation. Okay. All right, so the next thing that we wanted to consider are compliance cycles. So other cities will phase in, especially in the other cities are focused on climate change. They're looking at energy and carbon phasing in over time. So some examples of that are thinking about, like I mentioned, and we have this annual energy reporting that we can refer to in the history of, there's a lot more data there too, but this is an example of it, of what we know about those 1,000 largest commercial buildings. The top line here so we're looking at over time, 2016 to 2019, median weather normalized energy use. So it's been adjusted for, because in cold winters, we use a lot more energy for heating, or in really hot summers, we use a lot more energy for cooling. So this is a weather normalized comparison year over year for the buildings, a cohort of buildings that reported 4 years in a row. And what we see there is that grocery stores actually reduced quite a bit of their energy use over the course of 1 year. And it's very significant, and this actually correlates perfectly to an incentive program the Energy Trust had that was directly targeted to grocery stores. And a lot of national chains caught on that the incentive was too good to pass up and took advantage of that, invested into having more energy efficient systems like coolers, especially because they are very high energy users. Maybe you noticed this at your local grocery store in that time period. But then the other sectors, whether it's office buildings or hospitals, medical offices, we have a few different ways to break down our data, and they don't show much improvement. Overall, it's a 2.7% reduction over a 4-year period. That's mostly being carried by the grocery stores. So the other cities that are working on this, you generally have the same kind of benchmarking background. That's called benchmarking, because there's a benchmark that's set, and then we might measure the progress since that benchmark, or we might call it a baseline year. So the other cities are looking at, well, okay, how do we take this kind of flat line to meet our goals and then put it on a long-term trajectory to get to a final standard. So like in Portland, our final standard is 0 carbon emissions. That's our adopted goal. So over time, there'd be interim standards. So in other cities, in Denver, it's 3 years, in Boston, it's 5 years, in Washington, DC, it's 5 years. The example we'll be walking through in a minute here will be like, let's just look at 4 years, kind of in between that, 3 and 5. And 4-year incremental progress on the carbon is where other states are focused. And there are other standards we're looking at in Portland, but just we're looking at the carbon for a minute. So one of the ways to get there in terms of energy efficiency, one way is just renewable energy. We switched over to renewable energy supply. That gets us to 0. But we noted this earlier, that can be really costly if there's not energy efficiency improvements along the way too. So when we think about reducing the cost of getting to 0 carbon emissions, we want to see some energy efficiency investment. So that might start off with the easy stuff. Easy stuff might be like a lighting upgrade and building tune-up. And that would initially, like if somebody makes those investments, they might hit the target right away as soon as that investment's done. And then when they get to their next check-in point, an interim standard, then now they're compliant. And lighting, there's a lot of opportunity in lighting, so we point to that one. Building tune-ups, there's opportunity in that too, where often the systems are working great, kind of like our vehicles. If you ride a bike or drive a car, a scooter, all of these things, like do some maintenance on it, and suddenly like, wow, that's 5-10% more efficient. And maybe that's all we're looking for in the first interim. And then the next kind of longer term planning that could happen is maybe do an envelope upgrade. So envelope would be like weatherization, adding insulation, changing out windows. Fairly simple also additions, maybe a little more costly, but also could go a little deeper and maybe even exceed the standard for a while. So maybe don't need to act for a while after that. And then one other major system within that's energy using. In residential, there is hot water as well, but hot water along with the other mechanical systems, mechanical, I mean, it's hot water plus space heating and cooling. So that mechanical upgrade, we might want to wait until the system is actually done, because there's most mechanical systems will have like a 15 to 25 year life. And so once they're done, then it's time for replacement, upgrade to something that makes a big jump that could allow folks to reach that final standard, especially when combined with renewable energy. So that's an example of like the thinking around carbon standards in other cities, and that we're also considering here. That's my last one. But we also are looking at health standards. So we're talking about filtration of pollutants. Filtration helps with particulate matter. So wildfire smoke that enters into a home can be filtered with a standalone filter, or a filter that goes onto, if you have a ducted system, so a furnace, a filter that goes there. We have also looked at ventilation, so increasing ventilation so to remove the pollutants from the building. So that would be like we talked about stove pollutants, which are particulate matter for both electric and gas, but also gas having nitrogen oxides and carbon monoxide. These are toxic gases that are the result of combustion, and they are not as easy to filter. So a solution to that would be to either ventilate them or to use an electric stove instead. So those types of improvements are related to our health. Some of them are acute. Carbon monoxide is very toxic, acutely toxic. It does cause death every year. Nitrogen oxides and some of the particulate matter is more long-term, causing asthma effects, relationships with cancer as well can contribute to cancer. So, we're thinking like short-term impacts and long-term impacts. And then for temperature, last year, there were 60 people who died in our community from the heat. There were hundreds more who were impacted by the heat stress. There were thousands of us that were impacted in terms of like just well-being and being able to go to work. And fortunately, it was over a weekend, but still a lot of people worked the weekend. So we have these other priorities that we want to consider. So Irene's going to lead us through an exercise, be thinking about like long-term, yes, we do need to get to the zero carbon emissions, and that's pretty far out there. And one thing we want to think about is when do we start? But then are there other priorities in there that should come before that, should come after? And so there would be an interactive exercise to kind of hear your opinion on it. And we want you to kind of, every person will have a chance to add an input, but to be thinking about like, if we put everything all in the exact same place as we heard in the building working group, this should have happened yesterday. So I love that. And we are behind. We're in an emergency because we should have done this yesterday. But if we put them all in the exact same place, it gets harder to implement it. So help us figure out where you think the priority is. I'll turn it over to Irene.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen here so I can kind of explain the activity. So hang on here for just a moment. Okay, so this activity, this is a Miro board, and I'll share the link on the chat as well. But before I do that, I just want to orient people to this Miro board here. You may be familiar with this. Very similar to like Jamboard, or there's other kind of virtual whiteboards out there. And we're going to see everyone sort of interacting in this board all at once. It's pretty, there's no need to use any of these tools here. Everything, all you need to do, all we'll ask you to do is sort of place these icons in the timeline that you think they should sort of start to get implemented and sort of prioritized. So once I send you the link and you get access, we'd like everybody to place one icon per person for each of these categories, and we'll go through them one by one. Just some quick controls here. You can zoom in and out using the scroll on your mouse, or you could use these plus and minus buttons on the bottom right corner of your screen. And then if you are joining by phone and you're not able to participate through a computer, you can share your preference in the chat or unmute yourself and chime in, and Dirk will be monitoring the chat and listening in and to place those icons for you. So there's that option as well. So let me share this link with you, and then once you click on that link, you'll start to see everyone's mouth is sort of popping up and showing up on here. And then we'll start with our first category here. So you'll see all these mouths popping up, and
you can move around afterwards after you consider it a little more. This is for the purposes of discussion too. So it doesn't have to, you're not locking in to based on the knowledge you have now. We can continue to evolve it. One thing to consider is the baseline CO2 should be after 2024, because for commercial, we have a baseline from 2016 on, but we don't have a baseline for multifamily residential. So rental apartments don't have that yet. And then a couple other things here in the bottom, I love seeing this come in now, is we have a goal of 100% renewable electricity, working with utilities to get there by 2030, and 100% overall renewable energy by 2050.
Mm-hmm. So I see folks joining in. There's about 12 folks on this Miro board. And if you could, we'll go kind of through all of these categories one by one. So I see some folks already putting some stuff in there. If you can hold for a bit before you do that, and we'll just go through these topics one by one. And so, yeah, pretty simple. Everything's locked. All you have to do is sort of place these icons. So we'll start with community-based energy. And Vin, do you want to sort of kind of go through what we mean by that?
Sure. I think people are kind of getting it. I think this is great that it's already happening, and that we wanted to have an interactive activity to kind of get our minds and wheels turning, and we'll look forward to the discussion too. So community-based energy, we talked about this in terms of some different ways to source renewable electricity. And one of those ways we talked about was like on-site rooftops, which is pretty expensive relative to utility-based renewable electricity. But then in between that is community-based electricity. So that could be an example of the city is looking at resilience centers, where the community centers that are around town, for instance, could have solar there with storage of the solar and batteries. And then when the power goes out, folks would have a place to go and recharge their devices or their computers. So we're seeing that emerge in California too during the wildfire season, when they are intentionally turning off the power for multiple days to reduce risk of wildfires from downed electrical lines. And then carbon emission reduction. We're looking at the starting point. When should we start that relative to these others? Because we are going to get to zero. So carbon emission reduction really goes from that baseline year all the way to 2050. But at some point we need to start. And so that's kind of where we're interested in, is like, where's the priority in there? Does it start before or after the next one, for instance, maximum indoor temperature? So that's the minimum cooling requirement for one room that we've been talking about. Indoor air quality then is looking at what we talked about, like filtration of particulate matter and other pollutants, as well as ventilation. So more of the health side of the standards. Oh, go ahead, Irene. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no worries. So it's, yeah, you're seeing everyone sort of putting in placing their icons. So we'll take another couple of minutes here for you to add in your preferences and priorities for each of these. And if you have if you need any clarification, feel free to unmute yourself or add a question in the chat. But it looks like most people are getting the hang of it, which is great. And it doesn't really matter where you put it, I guess, vertically on this gray box where it says place icons here. It's really just where you think it should go in this timeline from between 2022 and 2050.
Is there anybody who isn't able to participate because they don't have access to a computer, and we can just do it through the chat, or unmute yourself and Dirk can assist? You can just say, put my face mask on this year, my temperature gauge on this year, my black cloud of carbon dioxide here, lightning bolt here.
Yeah, and just a reminder, if you could just place one for each category per person, that would be great. Look at that arrow.
I want to thank Irene for figuring this out. Tried to do it in a Jamboard and it just was not going that well.
Yeah.
Great option, Irene. I'm glad this worked out.
Yeah.
Looking forward to the discussion.
Oh yeah, I'm already seeing some common themes here, with indoor air quality sort of happening earlier than later, and then carbon emissions, and then and then indoor temperature standards happening after that. And community-based energy is kind of a little bit all over the place, which is interesting. So we'll give folks another maybe 2 minutes here until 2 o'clock to sort of start finalizing your placements, and then we'll go into discussion.
Dirk, did you see that we have a person using the chat?
Yeah, I got that.
Great, thank you.
And if my fan is going pretty hard right now, this mirror board is making my computer work pretty hard. If you hear some background fan noise, I apologize. Okay, we'll give a couple more, maybe another like 15 seconds or so. We'll see what people think. Okay. Great.
Like the popcorn in the bag stopped popping, Irene. Great.
Right. Okay, so which one should we start with? Should we start with indoor air quality? Just the ones that are coming up earliest. So I guess maybe just to summarize what I'm seeing here, indoor air quality seems like there's some agreement that it should happen earlier compared to these other carbon reduction and indoor temperature and community-based energy. And then carbon emissions reduction happening in 2026. And then indoor temperature maximums happening after those carbon emission reduction standards. And then community-based energy is a little bit kind of sporadic around this timeline from 2024 to 2034, even up to 2046. So maybe let's start with, or I guess if anyone wants to sort of, if any brave participants want to share kind of what their thoughts are on what we're seeing here, I'd welcome that now. Any thoughts folks want to provide on maybe why they chose or placed certain references on the timeline? Andrea, I see you've muted yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think for the community-based energy, I focused that out a little further because I think that one will take a lot of time and collaboration. And so I just thought that once we have these other things in place, that it would kind of make that an easier transition. And I think by the time we got to that point, a lot of people would already be thinking about energy and how we use it and be ready for that transition. And I put the max indoor temperature, that one that's in the front of everything, just because I think that that's what really is grabbing attention for this kind of work to get done rapidly right now. And that's what we're having the biggest dramatic issues with, just by people actually dying. And so I think that that is the one that we need to do as soon as possible.
Great. Thanks, Anjanette.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts here? Anything to add to Anjanette's comment as well? There was a question from Suzanne. Actually, if we reduce carbon emissions, are we not also potentially improving the environment for improved indoor air quality? So,
yeah, that's a good point. And so the indoor air quality, I think of that as there's a small amount of carbon emissions tied to the stoves. Most of the carbon emissions are coming from space and hot water heating. And in some cases, I think they're more rare. Those systems are not working and they're backdrafting into a home and bring the toxins from the combustion of natural gas, or if it's a heating oil that's still used in some homes, probably less so within apartments. but those combustion byproducts can come directly in, but generally they're going to be vented to the outdoors. So it's just contributing to the overall outdoor air quality. For electricity, the electricity is generated elsewhere. So it's not necessarily that it's causing worse air quality, outdoor air quality here in Portland. It's causing it worse in Boardman, Oregon for PGE. That's where the main electrical plants are. And then for Pacific Power, other places on the West Coast, even further east than Boardman, which is kind of on the other side of the gorge.
Great, thanks. Any other thoughts from other folks who participated? Me on, you know, I see kind of carbon emissions reduction sort of later out on the timeline from some folks. Any thoughts on that, or anything else to share? I see a comment here about public health costs being impacted by air quality and temperature controls during heat extremes. These impact high numbers of people and costs spread across all segments of society. So we can do much more very quickly for more residents. Thanks for that comment. Okay, any other thoughts to chime in here? We have, we wanted to see if there was time for one more question. Vin, do we want to talk about the enforcement question, or do you want to talk about the incentives question as a follow-up to this?
Let's cover the incentive. I think we might have time for both. Let's cover 5 minutes on the incentives question, and we can just do it looking at this graph and then switch to the enforcement one.
Okay, great. Yeah, so what any thoughts on what incentives could encourage early compliance or exceeding the standard? I'll put this question in the chat as well. Yeah, so what do you all think about incentives that could encourage compliance to these standards early on, or even exceed them? Any thoughts on ideas on that?
Maybe to clarify a bit, so if we have a standard that says you can't go above this air quality limit or temperature or carbon, then if folks are like, well, yeah, I totally agree with that. I want to do that sooner and I want to get there earlier. Sorry, that is the same, sooner and earlier, and I want to exceed it. Then if we were to have incentives, like somebody mentioned earlier, like that'd be cool if there was a recognition program that said this is a climate resilient building. Might be an example of that. Other ideas? Thought that might be a fast question.
Well, if there aren't any thoughts on that question, maybe we can come back to that and move on to the enforcement question. So here, let me stop sharing my screen here. We wanted to ask about how to enforce some of these proposed health, temperature, and carbon standards. So I'll turn over to Vin to give a little bit of background, and we'll do a little discussion before we close out for today.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so on enforcement, there's kind of two questions in there. One is penalties, and we'd like to cover that with the building working group when we have our combined meeting next week. But there is a question about inspections. And so here's an example. In Denver, for their building performance standards, so they considered penalties. We'll revisit this one. And then, sorry, here's where I really wanted to focus those. What we currently have at the city, which was news to me until I started this process. And I'm currently a renter. I've been a renter before. And it's like, I didn't realize this is the case. There was a person in my breakout group 2 weeks ago who said, I don't have heating. The landlord doesn't live here and hasn't provided heating through the winter. It's like, that's actually not compliant. We have a city code on property maintenance for housing, for rental housing. So some of those examples, there's a lot more requirements in this, but I saw these as when I reviewed this city code, which is Title 29, Chapter 30. Encourage you to go look at that yourselves, especially if you're a rental housing advocate. But I looked for intersecting issues with our work. So one of them is operable smoke and carbon monoxide alarms. The state has a standard for carbon monoxide alarms that are required. I have never seen one yet, so I can't wait till I see my first one. Maintaining a heat of at least 68 degrees without using portable electric plug-in devices. Heating and ventilation equipment free from leaking. So that's those leaks that can cause health issues that I was mentioning earlier, that it's rare, but it can happen. No visible interior mold or sources of moisture intrusion. So we aren't focusing on mold that much here. We need to consider how we might make it worse by making more energy efficient homes, but we already have requirements in there for property maintenance. Then similar to kind of the mold issues, just keeping the water out. Exterior walls impervious to adverse weather. So that includes wind too, not just water coming in, but windows substantially weather tight, roof structurally sound with adequate drainage. So those are some examples that we have. And then as we implement that at the city right now, can't advance my slide. Let's see if this will work. There we go. The Bureau of Development Services, who is represented here today too. If you have questions, we can do some Q&A. But they have the authorization to inspect to make sure that housing is properly meeting these requirements. The inspections are issued upon cause, which is a complaint-based system. Not all cities do that. So like St. Louis, that has building performance standards, they don't have health standards, theirs are carbon-based, but they do have a rental inspection program. So an annual inspection, not just to rent in the first place, but to rent, to have a license to rent. We don't have rental licenses here, but to be able to rent a property, there has to be a license, and then an inspector has to come out and look at similar property maintenance requirements. Otherwise, it's illegal to rent. So that's something to consider, that we've considered within the build shift discussions. It is enforced by penalty for noncompliance, and that there's a schedule that City Council has for that. I can tell you that those enforcement penalties are very light compared to what what other cities are looking at for noncompliance with the carbon standards, because the carbon standards in other cities are sized to to make sure that folks would rather invest in the property rather than take the penalty. So anyway, just some considerations before we think about inspections specifically. But I did want to open up to any questions. I think Beth Benton, are you still here? If there are any questions that come up about the current inspections program?
I'm still here.
Great, thanks. So that's part of our city resource team. Beth is with the Bureau of Development Services. So any questions before we break out to, actually we're not even breaking out, we're just gonna have a large group kind of open discussion for 10 minutes. All right, well, maybe we should go to the question, Irene, and see what we hear back from folks.
Yeah, so the question is, how can the current rental housing requirements and complaint-based inspections be modified or expanded to enforce the proposed health, temperature, and carbon standards? So I'll add this to the chat here as well, so you can take a look. So oh, I lost my chat box. There you go.
You want me to answer that one?
Oh, let's hear from everybody else first. But yeah, we would love to hear your thoughts on that, Beth.
Any thoughts from other folks here on any ideas on how these current rental requirements and inspections can be modified or expanded? Or any other considerations to think about as well?
Would anybody from Build Shift like to share some of our discussions too that we've had? I can also share something that, or we have team members that have been in the discussion around inspections too.
I will, Jen, thanks. I just think that I don't know, just from my standpoint, from the community that I come from, I think that we find like inspections intrusive, and it can just, I don't know, sometimes become a power struggle or issue, just having folks to mandatorily be able to come into your home. And so I think just our concerns around safety and just protecting like vulnerable citizens or folks that are targeted, um, when we think about how inspections are done and who does them.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anjanette. Any other thoughts here? And then maybe we can hear what Beth would like to add as well.
Are there ideas? If not by inspection, how could we assure that that these standards are actually being implemented? That might be another way of looking at it.
Sorry, I was muted. Beth, do you want to share what you were thinking?
Sure, and I would like to respond to a comment in the chat also that has to do with retaliation for renter complaints being a large barrier. And does the city currently have any protections built in for the current regulations for renters? It's not really in the regulations, but we have legal precedent that allows us to make the complainants, like if a tenant calls and complains, it's anonymous, it's blocked. We do not share that as a public record who complained. It still poses a barrier because a lot of times for a tenant, if they complain and we do an inspection, it's kind of easy, I guess, at that point for the landlord to figure out how we got a complaint. One thing that's going to kind of intersect, I think, with the work here is we're going to begin discussions here probably, I think, 1st of July. So boy, it's June already. To develop a citywide rental unit certification program of sorts that will be mandatory, but it allows us to get in and ensure that units are safe and being repaired and maintained without putting that burden of a complaint on a tenant. It also allows the freedom for landlords to call and get those scheduled, hopefully while the property is vacant. So no one's impacted at that point negatively, but it ensures that the unit meets all of the minimum standards and including any additional standards that come out of this working group for the this climate action work. So if there are things that we can change or amend in Title 29, which is the basic standards for existing structures, and this is like the property maintenance minimums, then that's something we can enforce along with all the other standards. So I think, there's going to be a good intersection there, hopefully in the future, as all of this kind of comes to fruition. Did I say too much?
Not at all. Thanks, Beth.
Okay, great.
That's great, Beth. And I think it'd be helpful for folks from our working groups, which is, the different bureaus, same city, different commissioners, but
one team, different roles.
And Beth and I have been meeting regularly over the last year with other bureaus too, because we want to be coordinated on this work. And so, hearing your concern, Anjanette, like if we can create a space to bring in folks from this space into whatever process you develop, which I imagine is a multi-year process as well.
It's going to be a long process. Yeah. And we plan on inviting anyone and everyone to the table, from the landlord side of things we definitely want to hear from the tenants across Portland, and any and all stakeholders are welcome. So we're going to be rolling this out in pieces similar to the work you're doing with this program.
That would be great. One of the things we talked about in Build Shift is to have give tenants the option, because we're looking at tenant protection here, to give them the option to opt out if they're not comfortable with whoever it is that would be coming into the inspection. And another thing that we talked about was having the inspectors not necessarily be city employees, because and Jeanette, I heard you say the kind of the how and the who it shows up. And so like in St. Louis, they some of them are city inspectors, but some of them are contract inspectors. And so if there are community organizations that could also perform those inspections that are advocating for tenant protections to follow the city code, then that from their own community, that might be another solution.
I see a question in the chat, and then I also saw Michelle unmute yourself. Michelle, do you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, kind of start at the beginning, like have it as part of the rental agreement, that this is what's happening, that the landlord is aware, the tenant is aware that this is a possibility, that this is a standard that has to be met, so that they both agree where they stand on the issue, and that if the landlord does, doesn't meet that standard, then that landlord knows, okay, this tenant has that right to log that complaint because it's in the rental agreement.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Appreciate that. There's a question here I want to in the chat. Can we have more information on who and how these quality of life issues are measured now, and how they can be improved? So Gail, feel free to chime in here if you want to clarify your question at all. But Vin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so right now, as we look at, I think Dr. Moseson really shared kind of the basis for a lot of what we look at in terms of quality of life, in terms of health. So we're looking at studies that have been done on through scientific peer-reviewed studies on the impacts of indoor air pollutants on health and the consequences of that. We don't have measures where we are measuring all Portlanders and their health, and as relates, it's pretty complicated. But in terms of temperature, we're in a response mode where we're not collecting data of like what's everybody's experience through the heat dome of all the residents in Portland, but rather we're looking at the extreme casualty event that happened that's on par with the 10 worst heat waves that have occurred in recorded history, that we've been looking at heat waves in the whole world. So I think if we weren't in such a response mode, maybe we could be like more proactive, like let's collect a bunch of health data and then see how the health impacts changed over time. But we are in a response mode at this point, especially for the temperature piece, I think. And I think as we saw in that last exercise, that there's a lot of concerns about indoor air quality and health issues currently. But I would also invite Dr. Moseson in to answer that question if you have ideas on how to do like epidemiological research or something else to really track like what are the actual health benefits that resulted from this policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. It's one of those things that's tricky. Like you always wonder, can you guys hear me when I'm wearing this mask here? Let me go back outside.
Yes,
sorry.
We hear you.
I'm trying to keep my husband from getting COVID. Yeah. Not exposing him to me. Hold on. So I think those things are tricky because, on the one hand, over and over again in a billion different environments, we know that decreasing particulate matter, decreasing nitrogen oxide exposures, and maintaining probably ability to regulate your temperature, save lives and have all these myriad health effects. So the extent to which it's worth continuing to study them, because they are pretty large scale expensive studies if you're going to do them well, is tricky because it involves a lot of proactive design, right? You'd have to like literally randomize people in certain, to kind of get this intervention or not. And you can get kind of real world things like that. Like the Oregon Health Plan was initially a lottery, right? You kind of ended up on it. And so we ended up with this real world randomized trial showing the effects of policy having these really beneficial outcomes. So it's one of those things where I agree we're kind of in a crisis and things are changing, and air pollution is becoming more of an issue over time for human health. Even if things are going down, like heat is increasing, ozone production, it's actually because you're taking a chemical reaction and now you're turning up the heat, which I think we all remember from like chemistry class in high school, like makes, things get a little more excited and more intense, or it speeds up a reaction. So kind of, especially with ozone, which is the one that we're also keeping an eye on. So, I think it would be worth kind of approaching, people like at OHSU or people who'd be interested in studying this, but I wouldn't slow anything down for it. And I wouldn't dedicate funding from this project to it, because I love medical science, I love medical studies, but it takes a lot of people. You have to pay a lot of professionals to crunch a lot of numbers and do those studies. So if someone can get their own independent grant funding to study it from the academic side, I think it's very interesting, but I wouldn't use any of the funding for this project to study it, because that can become a black hole, not to be too blunt. If that's helpful.
It is.
Buy the solar panels, don't pay the statistician, don't tell the science. But someone else, the universities can do that, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like people can get a grant to study. I think that's very important. And we want to keep all those people employed too. But I think there's a risk of, you don't want to shrink the size of this awesome intervention to study it, because I think the upsides for health are pretty evident, in my opinion.
Maybe put the money into the filters up front. Yeah.
Exactly.
And
that's the
see if
thing.
they
Is
work.
for a while I was asking, I was like, oh, should I get a CO2 monitor for my kid's classroom? And I was talking to this expert at Johns Hopkins. She was like, just buy another HEPA filter. Like it costs the same as a CO2 monitor. And that actually does something. And I was like, fair, that's a good point.
Yeah. Maybe we put all the filters in and then take them out.
Yeah, it's like you do all these. Yeah,
are.
exactly.
It's more
it's one of those things where I'm like, Oregonians are very similar to Washingtonians, and we've studied the, cleaning up diesel there. So it's like, it's going to work here because we're all people. So
we do have one other professional in the kind of this intersecting health world. David Delatorre, I just want, before we close out for today, I just want to see if you had some thoughts to share on that question too.
Yeah, hello. I don't have any additional, notes on at this time though. Thank you.
All right, well, great, thanks.
And there's one more question, or maybe it was more of an idea of in the chat. What if there was a requirement for property owners and landlords to pay tenants in units that don't have the HART standards put into place?
Interesting, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, so I think we're 4 minutes till 2:30, and I will turn over to Vin to kind of close us out and share some next steps here.
Yeah, so next meeting then, hope to see you with a combined meeting with the building working group. It's a separate invite, calendar invite. You should have that in your calendars, and we hope that you will join us. The stipend is also applicable to that, so we want to, if you are applying for the stipend, make sure that you do get valued for your time in that space as well. And then we'll be talking about a bit more enforcement. So we really talked about inspections from a tenant perspective, but we also want to talk a little bit about the penalties and then workforce development, and then also compliance assistance for owners and tenants. That assistance in other places is called the Resource Hub, and our national partner, Institute for Market Transformation, will share a bit of what those resource hubs look like in other cities. And then next steps in the policy process. So we're 4 meetings in. This is our final tenant working group only meeting, and we're going to take a lot of what we learned now and refine that policy concept that we provided at the start. And then there's still some outlying issues that we need to dive deeper into, and so I'll cover those in more detail at the next meeting when we're all together. And a kind of high level is that we have indoor air quality questions to be resolved, of really kind of performance versus prescriptive measures. So kind of going back to the monitoring versus just put the filter in. And then there's with the temperature limits, we were very split on where we think the temperature limit should be. And so we want to dive into that a little bit more. And then unintended consequences for rental housing. So kind of a lot of discussion we had today around displacement. We want to dive into that more. We're thinking pretty small groups this summer. We'll have a way for you all to engage into that. that I'll describe next meeting. And I think we'll do like a poll so you can kind of decide which one, if you want to continue with, and we'll try to work with your schedules to get a smaller group that is much more focused, that includes lived experience as well as technical expertise. Bring in some academics as well, and some other kind of professionals that work within those sectors. So that's the plan. We also have some other focus meetings that are just starting to happen. I mentioned before, regulated affordable housing, Native American community. We're doing a lot of the planning around that. Campus energy systems for hospitals and universities, colleges. So those are in place. I'll lay out all those kind of next steps, and then where we're headed is still not this summer, but probably more like September, fall, so we can spend some more time diving into these details to figure out an ordinance, putting that ordinance out for public comment in the fall. So that's the plan. If you have any questions between now and the next meeting, or after the next meeting, or some more thoughts to share, we do have those office hours. They are on Mondays 4 to 5. It's in the title of the email, office hours for Tenant Working Group. So it should be easy to find, but if not, shoot me an email, or Dirk Larson an email. We can direct you to that. Oh, I think I mentioned this, but they're also on Thursdays from 10 to 11. So with that, I just wanted to thank everyone for spending this time with us. 4 meetings, 2.5-hour meetings each, online. Oh, I wish we could have figured it out like something in person, but not in the cards this year, right? So thank you all, but I also wanted to thank Irene for facilitating and holding space in this group expertly. Much appreciated. And Wing, mentioning Wing Grabowski, my long-term colleague in the background. What smooth logistics. Wow, like we've gotten used to these things high functioning, and whether it's hard, sometimes we overlook how high functioning it can be. So thank you, Wing, for making that happen for us. And then the BPS team that were facilitators today, but there are a lot of other folks involved, and wanted to thank you all for not making this too hard on me. It's been a long few weeks. And then the Build Shift team for like the several years and continuing to be at the table. We meet weekly, coming back to the Build Shift team and digesting what we've heard and talking about, informing like how do we make these questions more accessible for the discussions, and really appreciate what you all give to this whole process, and really the draft policy concept that we've all been chewing on this last couple of months. All right. Done with my Academy Award speech. Thank you all, and we'll see you in a week.
Thank you all. Thanks all for your focus and contributions over the last several weeks. Appreciate it. Thanks all. We'll see you at the next one.